Hello, everybody. Welcome to That Word Chat. It has been several weeks and we've forgotten how we do things here. So we're just going to wing it, and apologies for any technical errors or confusion that comes along the way. I've already poured myself a beer. The reason for this is that a couple of years ago, at least a couple of years ago, I tweeted something. I don't know what prompted it, but I tweeted, boy, how much I would love to just sit down. If there's two people I'd love to sit down and just have a beer with and have a conversation, it's the Zimmer brothers, Ben and Carl. And so now we have the opportunity, and so we're just gonna have a fun conversation. There's a great many of you in the audience today, which is terrific. If you have any questions, please ask Heather to ask in the room and chat, and we'll get your questions answered in the room. So a reaction I got on I saw on Facebook and then on Twitter, two different people, both in response to this, having the Zimmer brothers on the show, said they're brothers. I didn't know that. So, and I'm wondering, do you guys get that? Ben and Carl, is that something you're both sort of known in your own circles? Have you heard that before, where people are shocked to find out you're actually related physically?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah,
great.
I think the answer would be yes for both of us. I nepotistically will try to point people to stuff that Ben does on Twitter. And there were so many times where someone would be like, is that the Zimmer, or are you guys related? And or wait, you can't be related. And now I just sort of preface it and say, like, the brother at BG Zimmer writes this week about this.
And I do the same thing. Yeah. But it's funny, we still, after all of these years, we still get people who are shocked, who might be following us. I guess it's just because we each have our own niche, and people are like, oh, it's the science writer Zimmer and the language writer Zimmer, and they don't necessarily see the connection. But so that's always fun when people are surprised.
Right. Yeah, it was fun. I went to the National Association of Science Writers conference when they were in Columbus 6-8 years ago, and everybody was talking about Carl Zimmer, just to see what Carl Zimmer wrote, and this is sort of an important person in that community. And I kept saying, "Oh, I know Ben," but Carl was. I'm used to going to the ACES conferences, the editors' conferences, and we all talk about Ben Zimmer. So it's nice when the worlds can intersect. So I haven't done the intro, but Ben Zimmer is a lexicographer, a linguist. He writes a column for the Wall Street Journal. Carl Zimmer focuses on science. He's writes for the New York Times, a regular column there. He's written 180 books. I don't know, a whole bunch of books. And so they're both, I called you, I was looking for a common description, and I used the term journalist in the emails that went out. Is that a fair word to describe what you do?
Well, Carl's definitely more of a journalist than I am. I mean, he's often writing about breaking news for the New York Times and having like front page stories about coronavirus and other things going on. As a columnist, I don't necessarily think of myself as a journalist, but I don't mind answering to that. And sometimes I do, feel like I'm doing actual journalism. In fact, the Linguistic Society of America gave me an award for the Linguistics Journalism Award, or Linguistics Journalism Award. So, I appreciate there being sort of a name for what I do, but journalist / commentator / word nut is good for me.
Yeah, word nut is what you use. So let's figure this out. What about the Zimmer brothers led you to be sort of pretty well respected and well known in your respective fields?
Ben, I would say that Ben just was obsessed with words from I don't know, birth, maybe. I don't know. Like, it just You know, just as a, you know, big brother watching a, you know, your little brother grow up, it's you just, I mean, it was just there from as early as I can remember. And, you know, just I remember, you know, when he was in grade school, the way to relax on a Sunday afternoon would be just paging through an unabridged Webster's dictionary. I mean, and I mean, we're talking like, I don't know, fifth grade or something like that. So I'm just extremely unsurprised, you know, that words have been just with him the whole time. So.
And well, since Carl's describing my path, I'll describe his, I suppose. But you know, he had an aptitude for writing early on. Was you know, wrote fiction, majored in English at Yale, but then after college, got a job as a fact checker / copy editor for Discover magazine, and ended up really, you know, learning the ropes about, you know, writing about science for a popular audience, but also sort of using his literary chops for doing that, which I think really still always shines through in the way that he can write in this very gripping, engaging style, which is, you know, kind of rare, I think, for science writers. But yeah, I don't think I would necessarily have predicted when we were kids that sorry, turn that off. That Carl would have ended up being a science writer, but I, you know, I think that Carl, I'm sure you already always had an interest in science, even if it wasn't something you pursued academically, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's things make sense in hindsight. So, you know, it's always a little it's a little awkward sometimes talking to, you know, people in college who want to like get their life all sorted out, and they're like, how did you go on your path towards this? And I'll just be like, I had no idea. Don't I'm the wrong person to ask. Yeah, I just didn't know, but I'm glad that I'm grateful that it worked out.
Mhm. Yeah. Was it Ben, was it, so Ben, you're a few years younger than
Yep.
Carl.
5 years.
5 years younger. Okay. Was it, so you weren't close in age. You didn't have that sibling rivalry growing up. Did you, was his sort of watching his success an inspiration, or is it sort of a whole separate path?
Oh no, he was definitely you know, kind of a model for me growing up. Sure. I mean, yeah, so that 5 year age difference meant that, you know, by the time I was in high school, he was already in college. But then, you know, I ended up also going to Yale undergrad after sort of visiting him and seeing what it was like there, and thinking, you know, this was just, you know, the coolest place to be. And then, you know, when he went into science journalism afterwards, I sort of admired how he was able to really sort of, you know, take that as a path and just sort of, you know, work hard at being really good at this one particular, you know, subject. And so, you know, I took a bit of a more of a winding path, because you know, I went to grad school for linguistic anthropology, went off to Indonesia to, you know, study languages there for a while before I came back, got a bit disenchanted with academia, and then ended up going into language commentary and lexicography and that sort of thing. But it was sort of like returning to my first love in a way. And when I sort of made that move away from academia and trying to write for a more general audience, I definitely, you know, it was great to just have Carl as a model for how you do that well. And so yeah, so it's been great to have him, you know, as that kind of model.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Although, I mean, Ben was like doing stuff like, you know, using databases to do research on the history of words and things like that, where I was just like, wait, what? You can do that? Like that, he was doing it so early on. I was just like, okay, I need to like, you know, yet again, I need to like pay attention to what Ben is up to, because this sounds really, really interesting. And, you know, you know, and I would say also that like my course into journalism was more conventional in the sense that I got a job at a magazine as a copy editor and did fact checking and just stayed there for 10 years. And Ben, once he was moving away from academia, was just like, writing on blogs, and then like, I'm going to write about, I think the thing I remember first, maybe I'm wrong, Ben, was like, you were writing about Brangelina as,
Oh yeah. Yeah, so
Mhm.
I became
linguistic phenomenon, Brad Pitt and Angelina
the
Jolie. And I was
celebrity
like,
blend names. That was one of my early topics back in the early aughts, I guess, when that was started to become a thing.
yeah,
Right.
but
Yeah, it's funny.
it was in People magazine, and then you're like throwing, linguistic theory at it, and I'm like, oh, I guess you can do that. It was really kind of revelatory for me.
Yeah, and that ended up being, really what I enjoyed the most, like, taking something that might be seen as a little frivolous or, pop culture type things, and then try to sort of dig deep into the linguistic underpinnings and like the history of how these different, words and phrases come to be.
Mhm. Well, and you mentioned that Carl has taken on some weighty subjects, certainly COVID recently, but climate change and other things. But what you do is not all Brangelina. I mean, you're writing about social issues and change in terms of the words we use, right?
For sure, yeah. I mean, sometimes it depends on the venue where I'm writing, So my weekly column for the Wall Street Journal is typically, here's an interesting word in the news, and let me tell you its interesting story, behind it, and that's kind of how I write those. For other places I've written, for instance, The Atlantic or Politico, I definitely get into more of those kind of weightier social and political issues, and how our language can, as you say, sort of reflect social change, political change. Certainly during the Trump era, I had plenty of grist for that particular mill.
Mhm.
But yeah, I mean, obviously, since the pandemic, and this is one way that Carl's work and mine kind of overlap. Sort of thinking about how in a world-changing event like the pandemic, how we see that reflected in our language, where we have to come up with new names for not just, hey, there's a new virus and a new disease that's caused by the virus, but actual sort of, social changes that are happening all around us as we try to adjust to something like this. And we see this happening at so many different points in history, and we just happen to be living through one of those moments. And so that's obviously been something I've been trying to keep up with as best as I can. And these days, there are lots of more tools where we can just sort of see new formations of words and phrases bubble up on social media and elsewhere, as people, try to come to grips with the world around them and use language to reflect that.
Yeah, and that is an interesting point, that it seems like it's a golden age of of observing words, because there is so much opportunity to sort of see things change. Is that accurate?
I would say so, for sure. I mean, there are so many tools at our disposal that we didn't have even 5 or 10 years ago. One of the hats I wear, chair of the New Words Committee for the American Dialect Society. I've been on that word chat in the past, talking about Word of the Year,
Mhm.
and I also oversee a regular feature for the journal American Speech called Among the New Words, where we try to keep tabs on all sorts of new words and phrases, and document them as they're happening. Yeah, I mean, it's just the ability to, I mentioned social media. I mean, that's one way that that you can track, not just day by day, but hour by hour, minute by minute, the way that people sort of try out new things in the language. Most of the time, these some sort of neologism will fail, but when it becomes successful, we can actually often trace it back to its source, and that's just something that typically wasn't possible before.
Yeah, so that's interesting. So we had a question from somebody who didn't want to unmute because she says there's a chainsaw in the area. So thank you for that. But Melissa Hellman, we wanted to put you both on the spot. And I guess let's start with Carol, because well, let's just start with Carl. Is there a favorite story or thing that Ben has written that you've particularly enjoyed?
I mean, he's written so much now. I mean, I was looking over some of Ben's recent stuff, and I will, one that kind of popped out for me just because it was in my world. He was writing about the word endemic, and you know, he was catching on that like this was a word that was being used a lot, and people were sort of saying like, oh, is COVID's going to become endemic, and then that's fine, right? And so Ben was writing about sort of the use of that word endemic, talking about diseases and other things, which goes way back. And now it's all of a sudden, you know, we're all using the word endemic and as if we know what it means. But the fact is that like, I mean, I think it was actually a really good piece of science writing because they made the point that like, just because COVID becomes endemic doesn't mean happily ever after. It could just mean that just a lot of people just keep dying, but kind of at a steady rate, as opposed to like crazy spikes. So yeah, so it is, I mean, it's important as these words get pulled out of sort of the scientific world into sort of the popular world with COVID, that people actually kind of know what the scientists mean by it, because a lot of times we just sort of throw what we'd like to think on it, like with a word like endemic.
Yeah. So I'm asked Ben the same question, but that makes me think of the I think the most recent story you wrote for the New York Times was about dead rabbits in Australia. And
I was going to mention that.
yeah, and
I'm on the dead rabbit beat. Yeah.
Is it? I mean, is it? And the idea that if something that mutations of a virus don't necessarily go in the way we hope, that things are better. And I have to ask, is it hard to write about, especially with the pandemic, where people were really sort of have felt very stressed and put down and sad about the pandemic, and somebody mentions the reaction, the sort of the anti-science reaction to it. Is it hard to do what you do?
Yeah, well, I don't know. I mean, I guess the flip side of it is that like in March 2020, or I guess February 2020, it became clear that, the New York Times was really going to be focusing a lot on this virus. And I thought, oh, writing about viruses is like the kind of thing that I do. And so, so with other colleagues who were writing about disease, about health and other parts of science, we all were just like, here we go. Like, this is where, we're next on deck, like this is our job. And so, we were bringing to it like everything we could of what we had been learning over the years, reporting on other diseases like Ebola, HIV, and so on. So, so I just was glad to feel a little bit useful, because like the world is on fire, and what can you do? And people, and like, I was like, oh, people actually really want to know about this, and they want this information, and they want it in an accurate form. So, so it does get kind of exhausting. Yes. I mean, when, you keep having to talk about tough things, but the flip side is that, we shouldn't, even if we are kind of tired of this pandemic, we shouldn't then resort to just telling ourselves something is true when it isn't, because it makes us feel better. So with Ben writing about endemic, something becoming endemic is not necessarily a good thing. And the thing you mentioned about rabbit viruses was just a way of writing about how people will say to me like, oh, well, viruses always become milder, right? That's just evolution. That's a law, right? And I'll say, like, I don't know where you're getting this from, because like, no, the evolutionary biologists I talk to, they don't talk in those terms. I mean, maybe 100 years ago they did, but they kind of learned that wasn't true. So, so you have this science fiction rabbit virus in Australia that has killed millions and millions of rabbits there, and it's just getting nastier over time since it was introduced in 1950. So, so yeah, I am enjoying now having a little time to write about other things other than COVID or rabbit viruses. Life on other planets and things like that. Sort of the more fun side of science.
Yeah. Okay, let's go to Ben. Same question. Is there something that Carl's written that you particularly resonated with or found interesting?
Yeah, I mean, I just recently read Carl's latest for the New York Times about that rabbit virus, and I thought that was just a great example of the way that he can take a story where it's sort of like, why should we care? And then it's like, okay, yeah, this actually tells us something very important, and so Carl is so good at sort of finding those sort of telling stories, or and certainly in his books, I mean, they're just full of these great anecdotes that kind of just start as an anecdote leading off a chapter, but then open up into these much bigger questions. And sometimes those questions are, what is life? Like, his most recent book, Life's Edge, the biggest questions that you could ask, but they might start with these very sort of, small details. So before Life's Edge also, she has Her Mother's Laugh, about heredity is another great one like that. And if I had to pick one piece of writing that I like best by Carl, I might go with that book. I mean, it's a very large book, but it's just so rich in its details. And of course, it's a personal story too. It's about him and his family, including me. And so obviously it resonates with me on a particular level, especially when he sort of gets into questions of genealogy, because I'm a genealogy buff. Our Aunt Barbara is in the chat. She's a genealogy buff for the Zimmer side of the family too. So when he gets into that stuff, obviously it's like, the way that he's able to sort of combine that sort of personal narrative with these larger issues in a way that can be engaging for everyone is just great.
Right. Okay. So I should hold this up. This is Life's Edge, Carl's newest book, The Search for What It Means to Be Alive. And this is just not as thick as She Has Her Mother's Laugh. So what does it mean to be alive?
Well, it depends on who's talking. It's interesting because like that book is in a way is a book about words, because it's I've been writing about life for decades now. That's kind of my beat in journalistically speaking. And but if I were to ask a biologist, well, what do you think life is? They would either try to avoid answering the question, or they might give me a definition which was very different from the last time I asked a biologist. Biologists don't agree on this word. And I understand that's kind of how language works, and words have different meanings or something, but this is a bit like chemists not agreeing on what an atom is, or astronomers not agreeing on what a star is. It's really kind of interesting in a strange way, and it goes back for centuries that they've been struggling to define it. And so I kind of look in the book at sort of, can we draw a boundary around life and say okay, inside is life and outside isn't? Well, you can try, but you end up with all sorts of hard cases on the edges where you're like, is this alive or not? And of course, it ends up being a very political thing too. Life. We have all these bills and laws being put into effect about having to do with abortion, which have to do with life and saying when life begins. which don't really, you really want to say to someone, what do you mean when you say life? Because, the facts of biology aren't really agreeing with what you're saying. So it became a very, it's that's what I like about writing books as opposed to articles is, with the articles, you're hitting the news. Here's what happened this week. Here's a new study. But with books, you can just jump down into these wonderful mazes where people are just really struggling with these what are not just scientific issues, but philosophical ones.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I wanted to ask you about also about this book, which we've been talking about. She Has Her Mother's Laugh. But we did have a question in the room, so I wanted to let's get to that first, if we could.
Yeah, we have a question from Dana. Dana, if you want to unmute and ask.
Hi. So I was wondering, I come from a family of word nerd people. And oddly enough, we really don't play any games related to words. If we get together, we play, Skippo or something with numbers. So I'm curious if your family, since, the two of you are, wordies, does your family ever, if you get together, play games? Maybe the two of you have, a Words with Friends game going on your cell phones to pass the time. I don't know. That's why I'm asking. And follow-up question to that is, if you do play games like that, who usually wins?
I would say there was a time when we would play word games like Scrabble. That was when Ben was very young, and it did not last very long because it just became when you're losing badly at Scrabble, it's just kind of a long process, and you're just kind of watching the carnage play out. And yeah, so we play cards more now when we get together.
I mean, yeah, I guess, yeah, it's been a long time since we played games like Scrabble, but actually, we played some family games of code names not too long ago, and that's fun. I mean, that's one where it's sort of like there might be fans of code names here. It's one of the best sort of word games of recent vintage, I think. But it doesn't give like a huge edge to someone who's good at word games or word puzzles necessarily. It involves just kind of lateral thinking and ways to find common themes among disparate words, and so that can end up being a fun experience. So I love that game and enjoy playing it with the family when we have the opportunity. But I think lately, we more card games, Mahjong, Pusoy Dos, a Filipino card game that my wife introduced to us. Those are our standbys these days.
So you're in New Jersey, is that right, Ben?
I'm in Jersey City. That's right, in New Jersey, and we grew up in New Jersey. I was going to say, we grew up in a more rural part of New Jersey in Hunterdon County, which is like west central New Jersey.
Okay. How about Carl? I'm not sure where Carl's residing these days.
I'm in Connecticut, near New Haven, in a little town called Guilford.
Okay. So, and do you both have families? Do you get together for the holidays and things?
Yep, I've got two daughters, both in college now, and yeah, we get together with Ben and his wife and their son as often as we can. It's always a bit of a drag trying to fight our way through Connecticut traffic and over the Tappan Zee to see the rest of the family, but we make it work.
Yeah. So you both grew up in New Jersey. Your father, I'm curious about, your father was a U.S. representative from New Jersey. So you spent some time in Washington, D.C. Is that is it, can we say anything about your upbringing in that situation that has led you to the success you find now and the prominence you find in your fields?
Well, I'll try fielding that one. So yeah, we grew up. Our dad was a lawyer who went into politics. By the time he was in Congress, I was already in college, and Carl was out of college. We didn't really have like the DC lifestyle, and he was more of a commuter congressman anyway, from New Jersey. And our mother is a local historian and also has run the family farm that we grew up on. But they both love books, love reading. We grew up in a farmhouse, but that was, completely packed with books in every room, including the bathrooms are all like lined with books. And so, it's kind of hard not to gravitate towards the written word and writing when you grow up in that kind of environment. Yeah, I mean, I got into, as Carl mentioned, unabridged dictionaries at an early age because my parents had this beautiful dictionary, the Webster's New International Unabridged Second Edition, this beautiful onion skin
big one.
Dictionary. Yes, on a dictionary stand. That's the one from the 1930s with the beautiful illustrations and everything. And if they hadn't had, the dictionary on a stand like that, and I didn't start paging through, then, I could have gone on a completely different path with my life. So, yeah, I mean, we obviously owe a lot to our parents in terms of just kind of opening up the world of literature and language, and, both fiction and nonfiction books were, surrounded us. And Carl for a while went sort of more in sort of the fiction direction and becoming a fiction writer, but we both found kind of nonfiction areas to write about.
Hey, Carl, do you write fiction now?
No. I mean, I was doing that some in college and a little afterwards. But I don't know, I just wasn't feeling that spark with it after a while. And then when I started like working at a magazine about science, and I was just learning about all these crazy things that, exist in the natural world that you don't actually have to make up. I was like, oh, I'm actually more interested in this. I don't, these things are so beyond my imagination, some of the stranger animals and plants and what have you, that this is what speaks to me more with the writing. Yeah.
Okay. So let's get back to She Has Her Mother's Laugh. This is quite a thick book. And as Ben mentioned before we started, he's on page 1. He's actually lead of this third sentence. You start out in the prologue talking about the worst scares of your life. I still panic a bit when I remember traveling into a Sumatran jungle, only to discover my brother Ben had dengue fever. So that's the whole extent of the story. But to tell us about what were you both doing in the Sumatran jungle? How'd that come about?
Well, Ben was spending a few years, I guess, in Indonesia doing research, and I'd previously visited him where he lived in a city called Bandung on the island of Java. And on that trip, we just sort of tooled around in Java and gone to cities and, various cool places. But it was very much a sort of a kind of a city and town type visit. And, I thought, well, I was coming back and I thought, well, there's this whole other side of Indonesia, which is, these magnificent forests that they have. I mean, it's just in terms of biodiversity, like Indonesia is one of the jewels of the world. And so I started talking with some primatologists who study monkeys in a reserve in Sumatra. And they were doing some interesting research. And I talked to my editors into letting me doing some reporting
At
while I was
Discover
visiting.
magazine. Yeah.
Right.
that's where you were writing.
Exactly. At Discover. Yeah. So I was in my, I guess, mid-20s or something like that. Anyway, so Ben meets me at the airport in Jakarta, and then we fly to a city in Sumatra where a primatologist meets us, and we start driving to the reserve, and it's like a 5 or 6 hours of driving, like up into the mountains, up into farmland, and then into jungles. And Ben wasn't looking great when I saw him at Jakarta, but I wasn't feeling great. I had just flown from the United States, so it's like, okay, whatever, we're just traveling. But like as we're driving in this, I think it was a Jeep or something, into the forests, like I'm feeling better and he's looking worse, and I'm thinking, oh my. And our primatologist, if I recall, Ben, like kind of took one look at you and said, I think he has dengue. And I was like,
yeah.
And,
I guess
and
I
she
had a
was-
kind of a textbook case of it, as it turned out.
Yeah.
In fact, when we got to the primate research station, they had a book on the shelf called Where There Is No Doctor, which was a perfect book for that situation. And I read it and I'm like, yep, it's dengue. I have the spots and everything. And it's like, well, what can you do? It's like, well, you just wait it out for a week, if you have a kind of a regular case, and take, paracetamol, basically a pain reliever, and that's it. And so I just hung out at this like bungalow where we were staying at this primate research station. Carl was off traipsing around in the rainforest, going after orangutans with the primatologists. And I was just back, waiting to feel better. And fortunately, by the end of the time that we were there, Carl had, all the research and everything he needed for this great article for Discover magazine. And I was finally over my dengue. So we were able to then continue on our trip. And we took, the Trans-Sumatran Highway down the length of Sumatra after that. And I was okay at that point. I was younger and more resilient, I suppose. I don't know. But yeah, I hadn't really thought about it from Carl's perspective so much until I saw the first page of that book and thinking, oh yeah, that must have been pretty scary for him to have his younger brother suddenly in the middle of nowhere, hours from any hospital, get dengue fever.
the thing about dengue, as I came to appreciate, is that it's a virus that you get when you get bitten by mosquitoes, and like a lot of the time it just feels horrible for a while and you get over it and things are fine. But there's also a hemorrhagic form, so where you just start bleeding. And
I did not have that kind.
Right, but you have to wait and see.
Yeah.
So I'm like, oh my God, like I'm just day in, day out, we're going to be waiting and seeing if he's like bleeding out of his eyeballs or something. Like, well, that was like very scary. And there is nothing to do. Like, I mean, if it gets really bad, you go to a hospital, which again would be 5 hours out of this jungle, where they will just, give you some support, and you just hope that things work out. So it was, it was quite a memorable experience. Of course, the scientist was kind of annoyed, I have to say, because they were very proud that their mosquitoes didn't have dengue where they were.
Yeah, no, I didn't. Yeah, it wasn't from there. I already contracted it when I was back in Bandung, the city that I lived in. At the time that I picked up Carl from the airport, I just thought it was like, it's just a 24-hour, 48-hour bug. But then it was on the way to the research station that I realized, this is not looking good. Anyway.
And the scientists were defending their mosquitoes as being like a better breed of mosquitoes.
They just didn't want Ben contaminating their mosquitoes, so that then they would have to deal with dengue. They're like,
so they
great.
had concerns of their own. Yeah.
Well, it's kind of like, Ben was they looked at Ben as a very rude house guest, like, I'm bringing dengue to the dinner party.
It was all okay in the end.
So it wasn't the most scary thing. It was more where you're leading with that is the whole hereditary thing. Your daughter, birth of your daughter. This is so you spent a lot of time thinking about heredity and what it means and how it works, and so you must have thought about your brother quite a bit in terms of how you both evolved. So what did you learn about heredity? What did your family experience teach you that informs the book?
I think that it's there's just an incredible, I think we have an incredible temptation to tell stories about heredity to explain our connections to our family, to our brothers and sisters, to our parents, to, you know, grandparents, cousins, and so on. And so, you know, I could, you know, Ben and I are both columnists, you know. Yeah, that's true, but it's not like we share a columnist gene, you know. It just kind of worked out that way. So in a way, like, you know, heredity, it's a very powerful thing. It's sort of powerful in terms of how it gives us a sense of identity, but it can be too powerful. It can be dangerously powerful. It can lead to us making up stories that just aren't true, or stories that can get people killed. I mean, you know, eugenics is sort of a story that some people like to tell about heredity that justifies some group of people over other groups through heredity. So, you know, the title, and She Has Her Mother's Laugh, I sort of came up with that as a way of trying to sort of capture that storytelling we do about heredity. Because you hear that, like, you know, people will just say like, oh, your laugh, it's just like your mother's, you must get it from her. And, you know, you think about it, like, what? Like, what do you mean? What do you mean by that? Of course, you know, it's kind of humbling, I have to say, that like after the book came out, I got contacted by women who had been adopted and then found their biological mothers. And as soon as they got on the phone and their mother started laughing, they say like, wait a minute, that's my laugh. So I'll keep an open mind about it, but I do think that, you know, we have to be on our guard about the stories we want to tell about heredity.
Yeah. So it's interesting because I found this really interesting. Also, the whole topic, because I was adopted and I have children of my own, and it wasn't until I had my own children that I saw that heredity in terms of you know, the physical attributes, but also sort of and you're right, there's probably a danger that I attribute some personality traits that perhaps aren't heredity, but simply upbringing or simply happenstance. But it's interesting to see, because when you have that experience of being in an adoptive family, you don't get those sort of things. And when I married, my wife has several brothers and sisters and an extended family, and there's the McFarland family nose, and you know, all these sort of traits and mannerisms that may be learned, but I suppose they would be learned. But it's very interesting to see how that plays out. So we had a question from the room. And it's sort of it's a great question, because it's sort of a throwaway question that you won't expect. And somebody said, I'm not coming off mute, so I'll have to ask it. But both of you, what do you have a favorite word?
I think I get asked this question more often than Carl does, but I'll let Carl start.
Probably, yeah.
Wow.
Do you have one?
Favorite?
Have you ever thought of that?
I hadn't really thought of one that it's not like I have a word on my wall. Yeah. There's just so many, I don't know. There's just so many like fun, lovely words in science. I think partly because scientists just keep making them up. They just do. They're just like, well, here's something, there's something I found, and like ordinary language doesn't capture it. So I don't know. There's one that just comes to mind that I find very evocative, is something called the pangenome, Because we think of a genome like, okay, you have a genome and that defines you, or like a species has a genome. But it turns out, especially, there are lots of species that sort of, interbreed and swap genes. And then it gets really crazy with like bacteria, where they just basically like just hand little pieces of DNA to each other effectively. And so the genome is, there isn't any one genome, because every microbe has like a little sort of chopped up version of a bigger genome that they sort of share collectively. So the pangenome, it's very mystical sounding, but it's a real thing.
Okay.
I'm making a note of that in case I need to write about it in the future.
You probably will, yeah.
Yeah, well, I used to answer this question with a word that comes out of that big unabridged dictionary, that Webster's New International Second Edition, because it had all of these incredibly obscure words. And one of my favorites from that was eucalegon, UCALEGON, which that dictionary defines as a neighbor whose house is on fire. And when I sort of found my people in groups like the National Puzzlers League, the people who like enjoyed, sharing these words, I found that other people like Will Shortz, for instance, loved that word too.
Really?
But that's an old word that nobody uses anymore based on some Greek, myth or whatever. I love all the new words that come up all the time too, and even just with something like with the pandemic, I mean, the amount of creativity and innovation that people have displayed in terms of coming up with, words, I think some of which we've talked about in previous and that word chat installments when we were talking about word of the year. So things like there's doom scrolling, but then if the positive version of that is glee freshing, or people talking about hard pants, like when they have to like go back to work and can no longer just wear, sweatpants or shorts or whatever they're wearing on their Zoom calls. I got to wear hard pants again, which is a kind of a retronym, a word that, describes something that previously we just called them pants. Now that we call them hard pants because we've gotten so used to, being more casual during the, our pandemic era. So, I when I think of favorite words now, it's things like that.
Right. Yeah. So the new words, you've been on the show twice now. We do at the beginning of the year, we do a words of the year, and we have all the dictionaries and organizations that, including I'm sorry, I'm drawing a blank on the
well, yeah, we have the American Dialect Society, then we have
American Dialect
Merriam-Webster,
Society,
and then all the dictionary groups, right? Yeah.
Yeah,
So
I don't know where. Yeah, my brain went somewhere else with that. Probably the dengue fever setting in. But yeah, you've been on that. We had a show just with you talking about beyond wordplay and puzzles and your whole history with puzzling, and that, unfortunately, that's the only episode of that word chat that's lost to history. Somebody recorded over it an episode of Friends or something like that, and so we don't have it anymore. No, actually, I think I just transferred it. I lost it. It's very sad, but we're glad to have you back now.
And we were saying this is my fifth appearance now. So
yes, this is
joining
your fifth appearance.
The Five Timers Club. I feel like I need like a velvet robe or something like they have on Saturday Night Live when people host for 5 times.
Right. So we went to shop for velvet robes with the logo and stuff. And it just wasn't in our budget, but we do have something. Heather, can you tell Ben what we're going to give him for being our first member of the That Word Chat 5 Timers Club?
5 timers get a fabulous That Word Chat mug.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you so much.
There we go.
Perfect to keep all those liquids away from dictionaries.
Excellent.
Yeah, so that's what our budget could afford. But I mean, maybe we'll do a 10 timers club and get you that velvet robe. Because I'm hoping you'll come back again. One thing that one topic I don't know that we've really addressed with you is your work at the Scripps National Spelling Bee. And it has only been a couple of years. It's very new, this sort of whole vocabulary thing. Can you tell us how that
Sure.
works and what your role is?
Well, yeah, actually, it was about a decade ago that Scripps started kind of experimenting, I guess, with having not just words, questions where the kids in the spelling bee have to spell the words, but also get sort of quizzed on their meanings as well. For a while, for several years, there was a written test that was kind of in the preliminary stage of the competition when kids who qualified for the National Spelling Bee, a couple of hundred kids gathering in DC would have to take a written test and get a certain score, and that included these sort of vocabulary questions. But starting in a few years ago, they decided that they wanted to incorporate that more into every stage of the competition, all the way up to the finals, where kids are on stage and being asked these questions. And so I was approached, I think it was late 2019, to oversee this. My previous job had been working at vocabulary.com. I was pretty familiar with the whole, business of trying to come up with good questions that get at word meaning, and like what makes a good question. And if it's multiple choice, like what are good wrong answers, that might sort of lead you to think, oh, does this word mean that or that? And you really need to know the meaning in order to figure it out. So originally I was going to be doing that for the 2020 Scripps National Spelling Bee, which did not happen. It was canceled like everything else in 2020. 2021, we came back and had one. It's kind of under pandemic conditions, but it was the first one that did this, this sort of new feature of every stage having a vocabulary round, a word meaning round. And we just had the second one using this new system just a few weeks ago down in DC. And so I was there for B week. And that was exciting because the one in 2021 was different. It was, because it was sort of under COVID protocols and everything, there was just a much smaller group of kids, just the finalists. This year, it's like 240 kids and all getting whittled down to one winner, Harini Logan, who did this great job. And it ended up, she won it based on this sudden death spell off, for those of you who might have caught that. And it's the first time that had ever happened in spelling bee history. So it was just like, it's exciting, and it's a great group of people to be involved in with Scripps. And, it's just a terrific experience. I'm glad to be part of it. And people are still getting used to the idea that a spelling bee might have questions that are not just about spelling, but about the meanings of words. But I think people are, most people are coming around to that as a regular feature that really kind of highlights the kids are kind of mastering these words holistically, not just rote memorization of their spelling, but really understanding what they mean. If there are classical roots from Greek or Latin or other languages, understanding what those roots mean and how they can, come together into various English words. So yeah, it's been a great thing to be involved in. Mm-hmm.
Did you do spelling bees as a child?
I did. I went out, I think, sort of at like the county level. I still remember, I misspelled nougat. I just, didn't know that one as it turned out. But I work with a lot of people at Scripps are former national champions, and I always feel a bit humbled. It's like I never got anywhere near that close.
Right. How about you, Carl? Did you ever do the school spelling bee?
I did it once, and I didn't even get to the county level. I remember Ben mentioned we grew up in the country, so it was actually at our local Grange, the sort of agricultural society, and they're building just in the middle of this farm field. And I just remember I misspelled collision, and
collision.
Collision. And, it still bedevils me today. Every time I write collision, I'm like, I don't know if that's right, or is that what led to my lifetime of humiliation? I just don't know. So yeah, that was pretty, not my finest moment.
Yeah. Speaking of humiliation, I don't know I've ever made this error before in my life, but I was telling Ben before the show, I I updated the website at wordchat.com, and have our next guest. Our next guest is going to be Ellen Joven, who's been on the show before, not nearly as many times as Ben, but this will be her second time. And I put as a headline, mentioned grammar table, uh, and I spell grammar as people misspell grammar with an E, like Kelsey Grammer. I'm shocked and ashamed. I've never done anything like that. But then, I always feel as an editor, making those typos, you really feel like you don't feel free to make typos. But I got a very kind note from your Aunt Barbara, who noticed it and pointed it out, and wondered if I was serious about it. So I'm actually hoping that Aunt Barbara has some stories to tell, but she hasn't asked any questions yet. I'm sure she has some very interesting stories about the Zimmer brothers. But while we wait to see if she does, not to put her on the spot, but let's put her on the spot. Carl, I mentioned you had hundreds of books. You don't really, I think it's 14, is that right?
Yes.
14 science books, and at a fairly good clip of writing. So what are you working on now? What can we expect to see?
Well, I am working on my New York Times column, usually one a week. I'm doing now, and I'm exploring some ideas for the next book. I want to write something that comes out of this experience of the pandemic that we've all shared. But I don't want to write here's the story of the pandemic, partly because those books are already coming out, and partly because it just it's been such a huge event that it almost doesn't make sense to write a book about it, or at least not to write a book about it now. But I feel like there are slices of the experience and that might be good fodder for books. But I've got my whiteboard where I'm trying to map some things out.
Okay. And Ben, it's great how many places you have your fingers. I mean, you've done so many different things that are word related. You show up in all sorts of different places, which is great. That's why we keep having you back on the show, because there's so much. You've written for the New York Times. You do your column for the Wall Street Journal, and you're constantly looking at new words. I made a faux pas on a show. We had Fred Shapiro on the show, and we were talking about you, and I said, you must be the king of anti-dating, and of course Fred said, no, that may be Fred Shapiro was the king of anti-dating, but what I mean is that you are your public presence is you're always sharing with us the origins of words. So but the question is, what are you working on anything in particular that any new endeavors, any reason to have you back on the show in a few weeks?
Well, still plugging away at the usual things, a lot of things that we talked about. And yeah, my weekly column always, is the deadline that's on the horizon. I was actually just emailing Fred Shapiro today because there was a Supreme Court case recently that was decided about whether bingo or electronic bingo could be played on tribal lands in Texas. And the Supreme Court case got into, well, what is bingo? And so I was just exchanging some emails with Fred, who really is, he was the trailblazer when it comes to like using electronic databases to hunt the origins, the early uses of words and phrases, and I sort of like follow in his footsteps for sure. But we were just, talking about that because he had looked into it before, and I found something slightly earlier, and that's always like the antedating game to like, can I beat Fred Shapiro at this? So yeah. Look for the bingo column in the Wall Street Journal review section coming this coming weekend. That'll be the next thing that I write about. It's always hard to predict, what's going to pop up on the horizon, though, to write about, because I try to react quickly to things that I see in the news, and just, have kind of a short window of time where, I tend to come up with something to write about on a Monday or a Tuesday, have it finished by, Thursday, online Friday, in the paper Saturday. And so I'm always doing this kind of rapid response. So I can't, tell you exactly what's coming up. I'm sure that, economic terms are ones that I've been writing about lately, stagflation and shrinkflation and skimpflation, all these different flations that we're experiencing. For instance, I wrote about the bear market last week for the Wall Street Journal and the origins of that. So yeah, whether it's economics or science or pop culture or what have you, I'm always sort of kept on my toes by new things that are happening, new things to write about.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'd love to keep this going, but we've reached that time. So I thought maybe at the end, if you two, you probably don't talk regularly, you probably email when you talk, like most of us, or do you have like a family Slack group or something like that where you two communicate?
We've been doing a lot of family Zooms recently. With
have you?
That's actually, yeah. As much as I don't like Zoom in a lot of situations, it's nice when we're all, a few hours away from each other to catch up. Yeah.
Well, maybe it's not necessary. I just thought I'd give you two a chance to talk privately among yourselves while we just, we'll turn away. And I mean, do you have any, thing you need to mention or catch up on?
We do. It's great when we do get to see each other, in person, and family get-togethers on the family farm. It's been harder, obviously, the last couple of years. But I was just kind of reminiscing with Carl about Thanksgiving last year, where it was one of those times that we could get our families together with our parents at their place on the farm where we grew up, and just spend some time, walking around, doing hikes and things like that. And it was just very memorable because Carl was telling me, there's this new variant of concern that I may have to write about. I may have to steal away and write about this thing. And it turned out that was the Omicron variant, which got its name the day after Thanksgiving, like Black Friday last year. And Carl, of course, was right on it. And he's like, I got to go write about this thing. Got to go interview some epidemiologists about this new variant. And it was like a front page article in the New York Times the next day. For me, I was just like, oh, interesting. What are they calling it? Oh, they're going with Omicron. Oh, okay. Because I had been following that news in terms of the Greek letters they were using after Delta, for instance. And they had gone up to the letter mu. And so the next two were nu and xi or xi, spelled xi. And they skipped over those. And went to Omicron, and that ended up being a controversial thing. But I was watching Carl sort of like, report on it, like the World Health Organization says it's going to be Omicron. And so I just tweeted something out saying, oh yeah, good job for the WHO to skip over these. New could be, ambiguous. It could be NEW. If you're talking about the new virus, that's confusing. And then xi, XI, well, that got skipped because it also happens to be a Chinese name, as in Xi Jinping, the leader of China. I just put out a tweet like that while Carl was writing about it, and my tweet got picked up by, I think it was the New York Post and Fox News, people, because suddenly that became controversial. And I wasn't even thinking about the controversy, but it was like, people like Ted Cruz saying, oh, we're, the WHO is just in the pocket of China, and this is proof. And so then somehow I'm in that, debate that I wanted to have no part of. It was a very odd experience, but I don't tend to have those experiences as much as Carl, where you're on the receiving end of trolls and people saying, oh, you know, how much is China paying you for that story, that sort of thing. But we both get that sometimes, unfortunately.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, well, you can follow both Zimmer brothers on Twitter and read their columns. And Ben tweets out his column so people can read it right on Twitter. And Carl's in the New York Times, and it's been great to talk to you both. It's been a lot of fun. We'll have to do this again, maybe in a year or something like that, because this was a blast, and I have a lot more questions that I didn't get to. So thank you very much. Next time, July, we're skipping July 4th, so the Tuesday after, we'll have Ellen Joven, another repeat person who her book comes out. Sorry, I don't have the date, but early July. Ellen's book of taking grammar table around the country and talking to people about their grammar concerns and learning a little bit about America in the process. She's our guest next month. So thank you very much. Thanks to the Zimmer brothers, and thank you all for coming, and we'll see you in a few weeks.